for people who don't know your work, could you give us a brief explanation of what you do?
So I've worked in advertising for nearly 40 years, and what I accidentally discovered was that what people in advertising and marketing do is quite important. However, what's really, really important is how they think. And we've probably made the mistake of promoting ourselves and justifying ourselves to finance on the basis of the short-term return of whatever it is we did. What's much more valuable is the insights that arise when you simply think differently. And all marketing means at its simplest level is you look at a business, or for that matter, a government or a policy, through the eyes of the people who experience it, the customers or the citizens, rather than, as tends to happen nowadays, through the lens of finance or economics or law. And I think those slightly aspergic disciplines have become completely over-dominant in decision-making relative to psychology.
And human behaviour.
And human behaviour and human perception, by the way. I'll give you just a little example. One of the worst things I think government tends to do is it imposes policies on people without a quid pro quo. Now, no business ever does this. It wouldn't say, we're just going to make this more expensive and we're not going to give you anything in return. It does happen. But what they try and do is create some sort of value exchange. If this, then that. Now, if you take 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in London, which I don't oppose, by the way, you would have achieved this with much, much less public pushback if you'd said, well, fair enough, we're imposing a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit for most of London, but in return we'll get rid of the speed bumps. And people will go, yeah, OK, on balance, I'll take that trade-off. If you give people some sort of value exchange, generally speaking, people don't find it that difficult to frame it as a positive. If you impose something which is entirely negative, different matter. And I don't think government's very clever in terms of how it effectively seeks. And I think the problem is that people are trying to win a debate. They're not trying to solve a problem. And the mental tools, Jimmy Carr said something very similar. I always think comedians are particularly inspiring. They fundamentally think about things differently, and sometimes it's really useful. And we're optimised for debate rather than for discourse or deliberation. And consequently, if you're trying to win an argument, generally speaking, what you're trying to pretend is that you have the single right answer. Discourse and deliberation are different. What you're trying to do is to reach an accommodation with people. It's much more, effectively, it's much more interactive, but also it takes advantage of certain psychological facets, which debate, i.e. trying to be single-mindedly right about something, completely misses out on. I was just joking to you earlier, saying that this huge problem your wonderful colleague Ian Dale had when it was revealed as he was standing as Conservative candidate for Tunbridge Wells that he had said some negative things about Tunbridge Wells in the past.
It turned out he had.
Yes.
He had
not that negative.
No, it wasn't that bad.
Now,
just didn't like it.
The creative solution to this, as I said, is you simply had to swap constituency, and he should have stood for the constituency of Tunbridge next door, because if you'd made hating Tunbridge Wells the central plank of your campaign in Tunbridge, you'd be elected with a landslide. Now, what I'm saying is
Tunbridge's loss is LBC's gain. He's still on the team.
He's still on the team, but there's a huge creative opportunity cost when you try and be right. Quite often the way to solve a problem is just to be interestingly less wrong.
So your job is to think differently and propose different ways of being that exist outside of a framework that we have got ourselves into, whether it's government, whether it's perhaps the media, other arms of the state, which is legalistic, slightly puritanical perhaps, and not particularly interested.
Yes, and also I think based on, and I don't know if you've ever had Gary Stevens on the programme.
Times.
He makes a very, very good point, which is nearly all economic models are based on the single representative agent model. The assumption that you take a kind of average person, and if you optimise for them, everybody's kind of equally happy. And he's absolutely right, whatever else you think about what he says, and I agree with quite a lot of it, he's absolutely right to make that criticism, because, of course, in reality, how people react to something, some stimulus, entirely depends on their individual context, personality, perception, and everything else.
So let's give us the stimulus of a new year. 2026.
The proportion of their after-tax salary they have to pay in rent. And then I realised that because they're only 24, they've never known a world that was any different.
Yeah.
And so you have to be about 50 years old to realise this is anomalous. And of course, if you are 50 years old, you don't massively care about the problem because you probably own a house.
Yeah, quite.
We also had, if you think about it, MPs for a period of 35 years whose principal source of remuneration was not a salary, it was a housing allowance. So we had an entire political class who effectively bought a house in London, and then we expected them to be somehow objective and fair about how you treat housing costs. If you think about it, if you've given every single MP £500,000 worth of Microsoft shares, it would be considered a massive conflict of interest. But because it's housing, we didn't apply the same strictures. Now, just for interest, we've all come out of Christmas, and all of us, I think, from the wealthier 25% of the population, find Christmas slightly overly consumerist. In other words, we're slightly horrified, our inner Puritans slightly horrified at the amount of money being spent on gadgets and, baubles and flashing lights and everything else.
Stuff that goes into landfill.
And so we're inclined to look at people and go, well, look at these people who are poor. They're poor because they've got a large flat screen TV and so on. It takes a sort of 50, 60-year time frame to realise, no. The thing that's keeping people poor is the cost of housing, which has continually gone up and up and up. The reason people have lots of consumer goods is, for the most part, that those things have become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And mostly, not always, better. Mm-hmm. And so those things are a smaller and smaller part of our overall expenditure, whereas the cost of housing, if you're below a certain age and haven't paid off your mortgage, is becoming bigger and bigger. So there's a fascinating thing I read recently which amazed me, which is the typical American home in 1950, 1955, 1960. If you added up what they'd paid for all their possessions, which would be one or two cars, television perhaps, oven, furniture, clothing, typically what they'd paid for all the bought goods in and around the house was about the same as what they'd paid for their house itself.
Oh, wow. Well, it wouldn't be anything like that.
Now, if you think about it, unless you owned art or a fantastic jewellery collection, it'd be impossible to find anybody in Britain whose possessions were worth more than their house, pretty much. I mean, there's probably going to be a limo driver somewhere, but apart from that, it's impossible. And so what you realise is that the extent to which I think the gains that have been notionally brought to us by ever more effective free market capitalism and globalisation and everything else have largely been mopped up in just effectively increased property prices. So that,
and particularly
in a sense, we don't become rich. And we've also created this sanctified asset class in property where one of the reasons I wasn't totally averse to the mansion tax was simply that it was sending a signal to people that property could no longer be considered absolutely sacrosanct as a form of what you might call tax-free capital accumulation.
Well, I'd like to come to some solutions for what might remedy the problem that you have a light on, which I think actually, if you're listening and you are renting, you can well understand as a massive problem, because frankly you are paying as much as you would do to own the house via a mortgage, but you don't own any bit of it. I heard you say the other day, perhaps rather mischievously, that there's a problem in government with older people.
Yes, we're worried massively about paedophiles in government. We also need to worry about gerontophiles in government, which is the extent to which the elderly seem to be favoured by the tax system in all kinds of ways, despite the fact that they...
You're going to get so much hatred now.
No, but this is, I think, important, which is your ability to tax any particular group is really determined by the Daily Mail, which is to what extent you can create a sob story around the affected group. Now, I'm not particularly well disposed towards six-figure earning investment bankers in London as a group.
But you're not going to get a violent.
I'm not going to. But they are undoubtedly inordinately heavily taxed. If you earn a conventional salary working for an employer and you're paying 45% tax, there's a group, I think it's about 10% of people who pay about 50% of income tax, for which they receive no gratitude whatsoever, by the way. Now, one of the reasons why they pay so much tax is simply that it's impossible to create a plausible sob story around any member of that group. They're in employment and they're earning a lot of money. By contrast, there are an awful lot of elderly people sitting in, 7-figure homes, 5-bedroom homes, which they occupy either as a couple or as a lone individual. If you impose any kind of property tax which would simply force one widow to move house, you've got a sob story. And so there does seem to be something which I think probably got worse during the Blair administration, where you governed effectively as a form of press relations, where undoubtedly we allow a degree of sanctity towards property ownership, and the idea that someone being forced to move out of their home is an absolute abomination. Now, if you ended up with £2 million worth of shares and you said, I'm running out of money, someone was able to sell some of your stocks.
Well, I remember getting a call from a bloke who was genuinely worried about the price of his weekly shop going up by 12 quid, 15 quid.
Oh, yes.
His house was worth £1.7 million with no mortgage. And you can make the decision to live in a cash-poor environment with a massive £1.7 million house, or you can make the decision to sell the £1.7 million house and be cash-rich and have a slightly smaller house.
And what we've done by making it effectively immune from capital gains, all kinds of inheritance perks and so forth, is we've encouraged people to put a disproportionate... I mean, you're a big pension campaigner, I think, right?
Okay. Campaigner, or I'm glad it's got to you.
But by the way, you still don't realise how good a pension is because you have to be about 55 before you realise the compounding effect.
Sure.
Okay, so it's one of those things where it's very, very boring early in life, a pension, and then suddenly when you're about 55, 60, you go, where did this money come from? We've encouraged people to put their money into an illiquid asset to which they are inordinately attached sentimentally. It's not a great form of saving, that's all I'm saying. And the extent to which people, I think, have used the property market effectively as an investment vehicle rather than I'm getting Marxist here.
You are a little bit. You're getting into
100%
100% inheritance tax and things like this.
No, it does strike me that, for example, inheritance tax should vary depending on how many children you have. It should be paid at the level of the recipient, not at the level of the person who dies.
Let's get to calls, for that is what this hour is about. Lots of people getting in touch. Dave is in Broxbourne. Dave, you're through to Rory Sutherland. Your question, sir.
Thank you. Happy New Year, both. Rory, thank you. Extremely interesting comments. I just wondered if we could hear your view on the welfare debate in terms of the way you see that unfolding and your views around the rights and wrongs of it, acknowledging that it's really important that we have a very strong and sensitive welfare state.
What Dave has done is put a landmine underneath you, Rory.
He has, absolutely.
And he's inviting you to step on
it.
No.
Fire away. I have no... one of the things I avoid is this kind of ideological... opposition to money spent by the state as opposed to money spent by the individual. Depending on the state of affairs in a country, depending on a whole load of factors, the ratio between money spent collectively and money spent individually needs to vary. And to be honest, I've always been fairly persuaded, by the way, by the simple benefits of some degree of wealth redistribution, in that £100 to someone poorer makes much more difference to their life and happiness and well-being than the same amount of money given to someone who's already rich. So I can see a perfectly utilitarian argument for redistribution. I would also argue, aside from anything like that, it's simply a mark of a civilised country how well it looks after people who are in any way, unfortunate. The phrase always used now is the most vulnerable in society, which I'm not sure is a helpful phrase.
Why?
I think there are instances, and it comes back perhaps to that sob story problem I talk about, there are instances where one thing I think that well-intentioned people on the left are slightly naive about is the extent to which people will game the system. And it's worth noting that there are various things you've probably heard about. The Motability scheme has been debated and so forth. There are various things where perhaps we have excessive altruism. In other words, our altruism isn't always very well directed.
Well, that is the sob story, isn't it? I guess the next person lines up to be the subject of the sob story about their I'm going to step on the landmine here, about their degree of vulnerability.
Yes.
What do we mean by How vulnerable do we want to allow people to be before the welfare state, taxpayers, step in to help?
And I suppose you could argue there's also a kind of, if you believe in, reasonably collectivist society, I don't mean wholly collectivist, I'm not talking about, Mao's China or something of that kind, can you also be extraordinarily deferential to outlier groups? Because in some way, the two are actually contradictory, if you think about it. If, in other words, if you give an extraordinary degree of sympathy to, very small groups, out of all proportion to the remaining 98% of people, it's rather like an analogy I'd use, which is you can't really run a restaurant. I always make this an analogy about freedom of speech in comedy, which is you can't calibrate comedy to the most humorless and easily offended 1% of society. It's simply not realistic. And of course, we're in a society where everybody has disproportionate power to complain, and also where they have disproportionate power to find other people like them who want to join in the complaint. Now, you can't run a restaurant which only serves food to which nobody in the world is allergic. I'm very, very tolerant to people with allergies, people with food intolerances, but there comes a point at which your level of, I suppose, deference to outlier groups starts to become slightly distorted.
Do you think that has happened maybe on the welfare issue around areas of whether we'd call it neurodivergence or mental health, that there's a 98% of people who are fortunate enough not to be afflicted with a variety of kind of things, who look at the level of altruism or violin playing for a particular group and say, hang on a minute, that's out of kilter?
Yeah, by the way, I've got a slight reframing on neurodivergence, which is I would regard it as a feature, not a bug.
Correct. Yeah,
There's some very, very interesting thinkers, a brilliant woman at King's College London, who makes the point that in any kind of human society, including sort of groups of 150 people, it absolutely pays in terms of the group interest to have people who don't think the same way. And I would argue that the non-neurotypical, their contribution to society has been completely disproportionately high.
Yeah, I would agree.
It also seems to be the case that in some cases people who are non-neurotypical have compensatory strengths, which make them particularly
I even think
valuable.
this notion of neurotypical and neurodivergent is difficult. How diverged do you have to be non-neurotypical?
No, patently, obviously, there are extreme cases where you find it very, very difficult to function in certain settings. But it strikes me that, one of the things we're doing is, in a sense, we're perhaps in danger of medicalising something which is a perfectly normal evolutionary response to the need for people to look at things differently.
Interesting. Dave, thank you very much indeed for the question. Andrew, I promise I'll get to your call too. I've got this from Neil. This is genius. This is why public policy is failing in the UK. Nobody's allowed to be upset about anything. It's not a left-wing or a right-wing thing. It just means we end up with government that is doing nothing. And apparently, is this...
That, by the way... not only doing nothing, one of the problems with government, it may not be that it's left-wing or right-wing, but it is just abominably slow.
Yes.
So the reason nobody's building any houses, when we get angry with the bureaucracy and we get angry with civil servants, what will tend to happen is there's an article in the Daily Mail which says that the Department of the Home Office spent £50,000 on biscuits last year, and this is disgraceful. That's not really... The cost of a bureaucracy isn't really in terms of the obvious cost incurred, or indeed the salaries of the people involved necessarily. It's the opportunity cost. It's the number of things which never happen because it's simply too slow, too uncertain and too painful to do anything.
And
anybody who's involved
in
building an extension or adding a conservatory to their house.
Have you heard of much of what Dominic Cummings has had to say about the
Blob is his great...
the constitution of the civil service?
And what you're starting to see, actually, is people on both the left and the right. There's quite a large group in the Labour Party, I've met a few of them, who effectively are coming to the conclusion that the Blob is, to some extent, the problem, that we've created... there's a similar movement in the United States, by the way, which it actually largely emerges on the left. It's sometimes called the abundance movement, who argue that something happened about the left where they, instead of effectively, in the 1930s, the left would be, we want your postman to be able to buy a hot tub. It was about material well-being. It's got all entirely about prevention to a point where any form of economic activity just becomes too high friction for it to take place at all. And the way in which, by the way, I mean, slight Angela Rayner defence here, okay? Which Angela Rayner, I think left school at 16.
Yep.
And she got into huge trouble for effectively some mistake, which could be intentional, could be accidental, in terms of the payment of stamp duty. Okay. Now, I've got a Cambridge degree, admittedly only in classics. My father worked in the property industry. I have no clue how stamp duty works. I don't understand how VAT works. I run my own business to a degree, and the extent to which about 50% of that effort in the business has to be directed towards dealing with some form of paperwork or other, most of which I completely have to effectively deposit on my wife simply because I can't understand it.
I was going to say ChatGPT, but your wife is just as good.
But I wouldn't entirely trust ChatGPT to do that, actually. I think that would be a bit dangerous. But the extent to which fairly straightforward things, like building an extension or starting a business of any kind, or actually the private sector is just as bad here. If you tried opening a bank account, okay, first of all, you spend about 3 weeks proving you're not Pablo Escobar or something. Then there's some money laundering thing. Then you have to send a phone. And to be honest, I tried to open a business credit card account. I just gave up because it was too much trouble. And the extent to which within business, by the way, there are these strange departments within business like HR and compliance, which are kind of weird internal monopolies, which make it almost impossible to do anything.
Right, so we've got HR, compliance, we've got old people with big homes, and Ian Dale, currently the targets of Rory Sutherland.
I was defending him.
No, I know.
I was trying to find him a way out.
Andrew is in Northumberland. Andrew.
Hey, good evening, Tom, and good evening, Rory. It's an absolute pleasure. I'm a big fan of both of you. So I'm the founder of a tech startup, an early-stage tech startup called Jobber. It's like a headhunting platform. And it's kind of working really well. It's just released version 1 after having our MVP out. And we're a two-man band, but I do everything commercially. We're bootstrapping. It's working well. We're slowly building up a client base. We've got some unicorns using it, all sorts of companies using it. They're more than halving their hiring costs. But I'm a one-man sales machine, and I'm using tech for emailing and everything, but cold calling is by far the best way to do sales. But I'm only one person, and so it's slow. There's not much to dislike about it if you're a business that uses agencies. So it's quite a good sell.
Andrew, I'm rudely going to move you to a question. You've done your sales pitch. It's absolutely wonderful.
Sorry. So we've got about 10. We stretched to 10K on a marketing spend to try and blow it up. What would you do nowadays? There's so much rubbish out there that's expensive. I don't want to plow it all on LinkedIn ads. If you had 10K and you're in my shoes, what would you do to really make it boom?
It may be that expanding your use of the telephone is absolutely the right thing to do. One of the things that is interesting in the tech world is that it's an article of faith in anybody in the tech world that you try and remove carbon from the system, i.e. any kind of human wetware, wherever you can, and you automate everything. In other words, you will have a very, very tiny argument in a tech world if you say, we found this way of automating email. If you go into a tech company and say, we think we should use physical direct mail, for example, you will have a massive uphill struggle, even when the physical direct mail proves to be extremely effective. A large part of tech adoption, I think, is ideological. I don't think it's actually empirical at all. I think it's a fashion, it's an ideology. The kind of replacement, all kinds of things like the replacement of human checkouts with self-checkout. It's simply too easy, I think, in the modern business world to say we need to cut costs and technology will do the job for us. And there are some things like sales where maybe the use of the telephone, in other words, old media, are still the best thing to do. Moreover, you have another advantage when you use old media, which is even when you succeed, your competitors won't copy you. Because
no one's going to be as mad.
Because no one's going to be as mad as to use. Now, interestingly, there's a very large tech company I talk to quite a lot, and they refer to their physical direct mail, which they send out, as annoyingly effective.
Oh, really?
Which is a very strange thing. It's extremely cost effective, but they feel instinctively that as a tech company they shouldn't be using paper-based communication or dead trees or whatever to reach people. So you have this strange thing where an awful lot of tech adoption, I think, is probably driven by ideology rather than by proper experimentation.
Well, Andrew, as they say on The Wolf of Wall Street, pick up the phone and start dialing. Thank you very much indeed for your call. Eddie, I'll come to you in just a moment. I have to ask you a question on politics. I don't know if you've been able to glance to the screen to your left. You would have seen Donald Trump, the President of the United States, talking about largely everything for the last hour and a half to Republican members. As an ad man, how will you persuade Donald Trump not to either invade Greenland or by doing so rip up the NATO alliance?
You'd probably have to persuade him, as someone managed once with a Roman emperor, to persuade him that the real power play is not to do something. You know, I think there was a Roman emperor who was told the most powerful thing you can do is not to actually have someone killed, it's to forgive them. You'd have to reframe the whole thing in Trump language. Now, 10% of me will defend him on two grounds, one of which is that he is, for all his many, many manifest faults, an extraordinarily potent communicator and has discovered a way of effectively reaching audiences and effectively, you know, being an attention magnet, which 95% of politicians have totally failed to do. We've had a few here, Boris Johnson being one, perhaps. Previous American Reagan was a master of this as well. The second thing is, occasionally when he does mad things, my only defence of this is, look, I completely agree that this defies conventional rationality, but it's not like all the rational people solved the problem.
Well, in that sense...
So, you know, at some level, there are occasions where it makes sense to try something completely different and see what happens, simply because... I used to make this joke that of dishwasher Darwinism, which is if you want everything in your house to be dishwasher proof, you treat everything in your house as if it's dishwasher proof, and after about 3 months, everything that survives is by definition dishwasher proof. And I think there are certain problems which are just rationality proof. In other words, we've tried to solve them in a kind of rational or economic way, and we've been trying for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and we've failed. At that point, you have to try something different and something perhaps unconventional.
Do you see British political characters as adopting the communication methods of Donald Trump? And if you do see that, do you see it working here? Or is there something uniquely American about it?
There's something brilliant he does, which is the very fact that it's unscripted, off the cuff and slightly random makes it like watching a live sport rather than like watching a recorded event. Because you have that feeling that anything could happen. You know, the second someone had, I think he's been speaking, what's it, for about 50...
About an hour and a half?
An hour and a half, mostly without notes, with no auto cue, effectively off the cuff. There are certain things he does which almost belong in the field of primatology or in psychology, one of which is he'll occasionally just admit he doesn't know things, or he'll throw in nice person, nasty person. He'll be rude to journalists. Some of these things are extraordinarily clever at actually conveying a sense of power, a sort of, you know, alpha male thing that's going on. So he's very, very good at communicating that in ways that defy all the conventional ideas about how politicians should communicate with the press and then through that to the public.
Do you think that's coming here? I mean, we've seen it a little bit with Nigel Farage being quite rude to some journalists about various things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very clever thing, which is that if you break a rule completely, if you never step over the line, I think you were saying while you were in number 10, there was this thing, whatever you do, don't make a comment which crosses the line.
The line was the
because
king.
Now there's a story and it'll be amplified to an extraordinary degree. Now, you could argue that the line has become such a constraint on how and about what politicians speak that the only solution is the Trump solution, which is you occasionally go so far over the line that when you subsequently cross the line a bit, it's no longer newsworthy. And it's, you know, I think that business of being deliberately outspoken, of breaking some of the normal rules of discourse, essentially there's something... You notice the most interesting thing I always find is that as soon as a politician retires, they become a much more interesting person.
Yes, or as soon as they're out of the job, they write their book, and actually they're fascinating.
Ed Balls couldn't stand him as a politician. Rather like watching him now. You know, if you take Michael Portillo, you could reel out, you know, Neil Kinnock, who, if you interview them, once they're out of politics, and then... So there is something fundamentally wrong with the way politicians are being briefed. which is one of the things I think is that they're probably briefed by people who say, these are the three core things we want to convey. Now, if you go into an interview situation and you're told, I want you to say these three things, you will say those three things, but weirdly, the net effect is that you become unconvincing.
Correct.
Interesting one I've always suggested, I think if you want to appear vaguely credible and trustworthy, don't wear a tie. I think the tie and the shirt and tie and suit, which was once a kind of mark of probity, trustworthiness and respectability, has become the opposite.
And that's why in Techland they don't go anywhere near.
No. So turn up in a tweed jacket or something, okay? But I think that they're being somehow very, very badly advised because they come across this idea that you have to stay completely on message and that we judge somehow the effectiveness and ability to rule of a political party by the extent to which it markets complete conformity in what it says, what it talks about, and even down to the phraseology it uses, is one of those things which is what you might call small-scale effective, large-scale disastrous.
Because no one believes you.
I'll give you an example. I can't name the company. When I first worked in advertising, there's a particular very large tech company of the time in the 90s which gave people incredibly strict presentation training. And everybody went through the same presentation training program. Now, what was interesting about this is the first person I ever saw present from that company I thought was absolutely brilliant. By the time person number 5 had come on and presented in exactly the same way, one foot in front of the other, every time they mentioned something, they'd make a forward gesture with their hands. The 5th person to do that rendered it completely unconvincing and artificial. And I think we've got a kind of tragedy of the commons here, which is that what may be perfectly rational for an individual politician in terms of how they present themselves, for the political class as a whole is catastrophic.
Absolutely.
And so every time we find someone who deviates, we love them.
People are drawn to them.
Corbyn. Actually, I mean, I'd cross the road to go and see a Corbyn rally. I might not sign up, I might not drink the Kool-Aid entirely, but, I'd cross
It's an event.
It's an event. I'd be curious to see what happened.
I think Will's a new caller in Highbury. Will.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Rory. Big fan of you both. I just wanted to ask a question about elite family land holdings and aristocratic land holdings. In the past, I worked at a 3,000-acre country estate in Hampshire, which had 50 residential properties held in trust, which was, controlled by the Lord and the heir going back centuries. And I haven't heard Rory talk about this before, so I'd just like to ask some question about how he feels about that.
Oh, dear. I've got to be very brief here, because I am actually a Georgist. Not many people are, but strangely, it's a belief that you should tax the value of unimproved land as the primary source of tax revenue. Now, the argument for this is very simply, if you buy a car, you're paying other humans money for something which wouldn't exist were it not for the efforts of the people making the car. If you pay a landlord for land, you're effectively renting from them something that would exist anyway. Mm-hmm. I don't want to get into this in huge detail because it really requires a programme all of its own. But if you read a book called Progress and Poverty, written by Henry George in the 19th century, it's Vivian Westwood, by the way, was another proponent, along with Winston Churchill, Richard Nixon.
You're in good company.
I'm in very interesting company here, but it's an eccentric movement that essentially says that, I would argue, and maybe I'm driven in this partly because I sold an apartment in London which I didn't need to sell in about 1994, which would now be worth £1 million. But one of the reasons I sold it is I didn't think I had the right to buy, through the property market, the right to tax the young. And that's effectively what you're doing. If you're a buy-to-let landlord, you're essentially creating a form of indentured servitude, albeit of a different kind, where you're effectively, what you're saying is, I plan to fund my retirement cruises through the efforts of someone aged 25 who's paying 50% of their after-tax salary and rent. Fundamentally, I don't think this is a good use of... This is an appalling place for people's wealth to be stored. I think the use of property, if you like, as an investment good rather than the use good is fundamentally distorting. I'd also create the argument, which is maybe the reason the 80s and the 90s were so good, was that people were getting richer, but property prices hadn't yet caught up. There was a kind of lag effect where you could, and I'm not making this up, if you had a reasonably good salary in London in the 1980s, paid salary, you could, with 2 or 3 years' salary, buy a 5-bedroom house.
Well, the Simpsons was I used the Simpsons. The Simpsons was the typical family that was taking the mick out of in the cartoon. No, that is now aspirational. No one in their 30s can do that. One person going out and working, mum staying at home, 3 kids, car, mortgage.
Do you want a really depressing thing?
Please.
Most of the gains that should have arisen through the 2-income household have simply been soaked up by the property market. So it went from being, there was a brief period where if both of you, husband and wife, say, or both partners, went out to work, you earned twice as much and your rent was the same. Wonderful. You had better holidays, better cars, all sorts of things. Eventually what happened is both of you working, the 2-income household went from being an option to an obligation. In other words, you couldn't afford a place to live without 2 salaries to fund the property. So what actually happened to the typical British family? I know this is really depressing. By the way, it's not an anti-feminist message at all. I'm not suggesting for a second that people should necessarily return to live at home. But effectively, it went from being an option, if we like, we can both earn, to an obligation. So the typical family has lost 40 hours of discretionary time every week for no real improvement in discretionary spending. And so if we have this system where the property market effectively becomes the sponge into which all discretionary income ultimately ends up being soaked, then you could argue, well, we could reduce taxes if all that happens by reducing taxes is that property becomes a bit more expensive. What was the point?
People should be Georgists, perhaps. Well, thank you very much indeed. Let me put this to you from Charlotte in Brighton. How would you save the pub? The government is determined to kill us. You've seen this change to business rates.
This is a really important point. By the way, we're always talking about how do we save the high street, how do we save communities. This really fascinates me because there's a great guy who you must get on the show called Paul Dolan, Professor of Behavioural Science at London School of Economics. He makes the point that what we talk about, what dominates a conversation in any particular field, for example, a huge conversation about diet in terms of people's health. So, tons and tons of conversation about, the nature of what people eat and when they eat. But the 2 other equally important things in terms of people's health are, one, sleep, which gets a tiny percentage of the discussion. And the other one is companionship, sociability, social life. I mean, friendship, hanging out with other people, is an extraordinary contributor both to human well-being and indeed to longevity, it seems. Loneliness is a kind of epidemic, but it has far worse problems than just the immediate one. And so it strikes me that a pub or a coffee shop, for that matter, we shouldn't necessarily only prioritise pubs, is both a private business, but it's also a public good. And maybe it deserves some sort of tax break. All the more so, you might argue, because, well, if a 17th women's clothes shop opens in Sevenoaks, it doesn't make, or closes down, it doesn't make that much difference to my well-being, and you can also buy clothes online. A pub is irreplaceable. It's also, by the way, a British cultural achievement which is entirely unique and fascinatingly hasn't really been replicated successfully by any other country.
But they say, we've only got a minute and a half.
Oh, sorry.
But they say the young aren't interested in pubs because they don't drink.
Not true. We've got to be really, really careful about this. There are these things which are called by Rob Henderson, a friend of mine, luxury beliefs. And there are certain things which just enter the conversation and become universally believed because they're sort of fashionable things to repeat at dinner parties. The idea that Gen Z are drinking significantly less than other generations has been massively exaggerated. I mean, if that were true, my daughter wouldn't have woken up on a night bus at Heathrow Airport the other week. But I won't say which daughter. She listens to the programme.
Right,
but there are certain beliefs which just enter the sort of discourse and become assumed. It's a bit like sourdough. There's too much of it, OK? Don't get me wrong, I like a bit of sourdough, but it's become overly dominant. And in the same way, in conversation, you get these particular tropes which are just ludicrously dominant. The other one that drives me insane is the anti-car movement, where a tiny percentage of people who happen to live in the middle of London go, of course, the future is all about mass transit. 90% of all journey miles in the UK take place by car. There is no way of changing that without moving everybody into the centre of a city.
And in 30 seconds, while I have you, what communication advice would you give our Prime Minister?
Oh, bloody hell. I think he's been a little bit harshly treated. However, borrow one or two things from the Trump playbook. Maybe it's too late. But that business of go over the line and then you have immediate freedom to cross the line judiciously going forward. Whereas this utter conformity. But the other one is maybe just stop caring so much about what the media thinks and instead look for creative ways in which you can actually make people happier without necessarily treating... I mean, the problem with government is it doesn't have a marketing function. It has a communications function, it has an obsessive press relations function, but actually finding out through deliberative democracy what it is that people want and might make them happier, which may be, by the way, a hell of a lot of this might be potholes. It may be unbelievably banal and unfashionable, but most people, most of the time, live their lives locally.